For 30 years, Johnny Carson interviewed more people on television than perhaps anyone in history. Along the way, he built a handful of genuine, well-documented relationships, some warm, some strained, a few that ended in total silence. Unlike the tabloid-style secret blacklist stories that circulate online, the real record comes from Carson's own colleagues, biographers, and the guests themselves, and it's stranger and more human than any invented version could be. The most enduring relationship of Carson's career was with his announcer and sidekick, Ed McMahon. The two met in 1958 on The Game, Show Who Do You Trust? And stayed connected for 46 years, through 3 decades of nightly television together on The Tonight Show. McMahon spent years pushing back on the assumption that their partnership was just a paycheck arrangement. In his memoir, Here's Johnny, published a year after Carson's death, McMahon described a real friendship that existed almost entirely off camera. Carson was famously private and reserved with people who hadn't earned his trust, and McMahon was one of the very few who had. Site index equals 15-1. Carson was a dear friend who made McMahon very happy, though that wasn't a side Carson shared with many people. Very few grew close enough to get past his guarded exterior. Site. McMahon himself acknowledged the relationship had real complexity to it. Site index equals 24-1. He described their bond as being as close as 2 non-married people can be, but admitted the two rarely spoke in Carson's later years, saying Carson doesn't give friendship easily or need it. He packs a tight suitcase. Site, there's a well-documented on-air moment that captures the push and pull of their dynamic. During a monologue joke about mosquitoes preferring warm-blooded, passionate people, McMahon jumped in with his own punchline before Carson could deliver it. Site index equals 24-1. The audience roared, but Carson reportedly glared icily at McMahon for stealing the joke and was, by some accounts, angry enough that he nearly fired him over it. Site, it was a flash of real friction between two men who nonetheless stayed close for the rest of Carson's life. When Carson gave his final sign-off in 1992, he made a point of publicly crediting McMahon's steadiness at his side for 3 decades, and by all accounts, that part wasn't an act. If McMahon represents the loyalty side of Carson's personality, his relationship with Joan Rivers shows the other side, and it's one of the most thoroughly documented ruptures in television history. Rivers first appeared on The Tonight Show in 1965 and went on to become one of Carson's most frequent guests, eventually appearing close to 100 times and serving as his permanent guest host by the early 1980s. Site index equals 8-1. Carson considered her a favorite, and off-camera, she viewed him as a professional mentor. He'd even introduced her to her husband, Edgar Rosenberg. Site. That relationship collapsed in 1986 when Rivers accepted an offer to host her own late-night program on the fledgling Fox network, a direct competitor to Carson's show, without telling him first. Site index equals 12-1. Rivers made television history as the first woman to host a late-night broadcast talk show, becoming the first face of Fox's new network. Site, the problem, according to people close to both of them, was never that she left. It was how she left. Site index equals 2-1. Her refusal to inform Carson directly about the new show, combined with attempts to bring key Tonight Show crew members with her, was seen as a breach of trust the relationship never recovered from. Site. According to Carson's longtime executive producer Peter LaSalle, quoted in journalist Mark Mokoff's biography Love Johnny Carson, site index equals 6-1. Carson was devastated by the news, and Rivers handled it terribly. Site, the IMDb trivia record for the show, compiled from multiple contemporaneous accounts, lays out just how final the break was. Site index equals 47-1. When Rivers called Carson after her own press conference announcing the Fox deal, he was too furious to take the call, and he canceled her 3 remaining weeks as scheduled guest host. He never spoke to her again. Site, the rift reportedly went beyond professional distance. Site index equals 47-1. When Rivers later sent flowers and a condolence note after Carson's son Rick died in an accident, Carson sent them back. Site. Rivers herself was banned from ever appearing on The Tonight Show again, a ban that Carson's successor, Jay Leno, chose to honor for the entirety of his own run as host. Site index equals 13-1. It wasn't until 2014, under Jimmy Fallon, that Rivers finally returned to the show, 26 years after the falling out and 8 years after Carson's death. Site notably, Ed McMahon was one of the few people in Carson's circle who refused to freeze Rivers out socially in the years after the split. Site index equals 25-1. Rivers recalled that McMahon would always make a point of greeting her warmly if their paths crossed, going against quote-unquote boss orders. Site. Carson's relationship with David Letterman tells a different kind of story. Not a feud, but a mentorship that outlasted Carson's own career. Letterman got his start as a stand-up guest on The Tonight Show in the late 1970s, and quickly became one of Carson's most trusted young comedians, eventually landing his own NBC show, Late Night with David Letterman, immediately following Carson's program. For years, it was widely assumed within NBC and among viewers that when Carson retired, Letterman, the heir apparent in spirit if not in title, would inherit the 11:30 p.m. chair. Site index equals 43-1. Instead, following Carson's final Tonight Show appearance on May 22, 1992, NBC gave the job to Jay Leno, setting off a public feud between Leno and Letterman that would run for years. Site. Carson's own preference in that succession battle was something of an open secret in later years, though he mostly avoided commenting on it publicly. What he did do, quietly, was keep writing. After retiring, Carson largely vanished from public life, but according to his former producer Peter LaSalle, he never lost his appetite for topical monologue jokes. Site index equals 34-1. LaSalle said Carson would read the newspaper each morning, dream up jokes about the news, and periodically send them along to Letterman, who would fold them into his own monologue at CBS's Late Show, an arrangement LaSalle said gave Carson a big kick. Site. That arrangement culminated in one of the most quietly moving moments in late-night history. Site index equals 30-1. The night after Carson's death in January 2005, Letterman opened his show with a monologue made up entirely of jokes Carson had sent him in his final months, material touching on Paris Hilton and Donald Trump's hair, among other topics of the day, and only revealed after the monologue that every joke had come from Carson. Site index equals 42-1. Letterman later said of Carson, "He gave me a shot on his show, and in doing so, he gave me a career. A night doesn't go by that I don't ask myself, what would Johnny have done?" Site. If there's a real, well-sourced answer to who was the guest Carson privately disliked most, it isn't a scandalous secret. It's Bob Hope, one of the most frequent guests in the show's history, and on paper, a natural fit for Carson's brand of comedy. According to Richard Zoglin's biography Hope, Entertainer of the Century, the two men's styles simply didn't mesh off camera. Site index equals 46-1. Carson never warmed to Hope, either personally or professionally, Zoglin wrote, noting that Carson idolized older comedians like Jack Benny and George Burns, but never extended that same admiration to Hope. Site. The friction reportedly came down to authenticity. Carson prized spontaneity and dreaded canned material. Site index equals 52-1. Hope had a habit of arriving with pre-written jokes rehearsed in advance, which struck Carson as inauthentic. His former co-head writer Andrew Nichols said Carson appreciated people who he felt engaged with the real world, and there was nothing to talk to Bob about. Site. It a mundane, believable kind of dislike, a mismatch of comedic philosophy between two professionals, rather than anything approaching a hidden scandal. Not every real story about Carson and a difficult guest was about personality friction. One of the best documented incidents involves Carson actively working behind the scenes to expose a guest he considered a fraud, the self-described psychic Uri Geller. Carson had a serious background as an amateur magician and had little patience for performers who claimed supernatural powers rather than showmanship. Site index equals 49-1. According to Mark Malkoff's book, Carson hated mentalists like Geller, who claimed to have psychic and supernatural powers, and privately planned to use his platform to expose Geller as a fake. Site. Rather than confronting Geller directly, Carson made a quiet production change. Geller's act depended on manipulating metal objects he claimed to bend with his mind. So Carson had his staff make sure nothing Geller would use on air was accessible to him beforehand. Site index equals 49-1. The result, by design, was a disaster. Geller spent nearly half an hour across several segments attempting his trick and barely managed to bend a single spoon. Site. It remains one of the most replayed clips from the Carson era, and unlike many gotcha viral stories, This one is corroborated by production accounts from people who were actually there. Not every long-running tension in Carson's world involved a guest. One of the most drawn out was with a fellow host. Carson and Merv Griffin launched their talk show careers on the very same night, October 1st, 1962, both on NBC, and for a stretch, working out of the same building. Site index equals 69-1. Carson began his run on The Tonight Show that night, while Griffin launched a daytime hour, also on NBC, out of the same Studio 6B at Rockefeller Center. /site. That proximity bred real competition. According to Griffin biographer Steve Randesai, the two men were fighting over the same pool of big-name guests from day one. Site index equals 72-1. They were working for the same company, and they were on the same network. They were using the same studio, but there was this competition for getting the big-name guests, Randesai explained. /site, the rivalry didn't fade when Griffin moved networks. Site index equals 67-1. It intensified once Griffin left NBC for CBS and became direct late-night competition. And it wasn't purely professional. A contract dispute over comedian George Carlin, whom Griffin refused to release to appear on Carson's show, escalated all the way to a union grievance. /site. What makes the story worth telling, though, is how it ended. As both men aged and their positions in the industry became secure, the competitive edge dulled. Site index equals 60-1. They're much older now. They don't have anything to prove anymore. They don't have to fight over guests. They certainly don't have to fight over money. And a friendship evolved, Randesai said. /site, Carson eventually had Griffin on as a guest 3 times, including, fittingly, the night Griffin's own show finally went off the air in September 1986, marking Griffin's first Tonight Show appearance since 1962. Site index equals 66-1. Carson even quietly protected the friendship on air. During a bit at his desk poking fun at various entertainers, Carson stopped himself before reading a card about Griffin, saying, "No, I'm not going to do this one. He's a friend of mine now. I can't do it." /site, the connection ran deeper, behind the scenes, too. Site index equals 66-1. Griffin later hired Carson's own brother, Dick, who had directed The Tonight Show, to direct the Merv Griffin Show after it relocated to California. And Dick Carson stayed with Griffin all the way through to Wheel of Fortune. /site. Carson rarely commented publicly on NBC's choice of Jay Leno as his successor, but there's documented evidence he kept a close, occasionally prickly eye on how the industry treated the topic even after he'd left the chair. According to Mark Mokoff's reporting, Carson's sensitivity resurfaced during a May 1991 taping, after word reached him that Saturday Night Live was planning another sketch parodying him. Site index equals 65-1. Leno, a guest on the show that night, reportedly overheard Carson in the hallway saying, "If they're going to make fun of me, it's time to go." /site, it's a small moment, but a telling one, evidence that even at the peak of his career, Carson was quietly attentive to how he was being portrayed, and that the pressures around his eventual exit were weighing on him well before he made his retirement official the following year. Carson also had quieter rules that shaped who got booked at all, rules with nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with format. He was notably protective of the line between reality and performance on his show. According to Mokoff's reporting, Carson refused to book performers who only appeared in character, worried that home audiences might not be able to tell fiction from fact. Site index equals 58-1. That policy reportedly kept Paul Reubens off the show as Pee Wee Herman, and for the same reason Carson also declined to book comedians like Gilbert Gottfried or Bobcat Goldthwait when their acts leaned heavily on persona, making exceptions only for performers whose characters were unmistakably a put-on, like Bob Einstein's Super Dave Osborne or Don Novello's Father Guido Sarducci. /site. None of this paints Carson as either a saint or a secret villain. It paints him as a working professional with real preferences, real loyalties, and a couple of grudges he nursed for decades. He kept Ed McMahon close for 46 years despite genuine friction. He cut off one of his favorite, most frequent guests completely over a breach of trust and never looked back. He quietly mentored the comedian he clearly wanted to succeed him, even after that succession never happened. He disliked a comedy legend not because of any hidden cruelty, but because their sense of humor didn't match. He spent decades in professional combat with a rival host over the same pool of guests, and mellowed into real friendship once neither of them had anything left to prove. And when he thought a guest was defrauding his audience, he didn't ban them. He simply made sure the cameras caught the truth. That's a more complicated, more interesting Johnny Carson than any invented blacklist, because it's the one that actually happened, and it's backed by the people who were standing next to him when it did.